We're picking up in the middle of where we left off. Where we last left off, I believe we were talking about critical race theory, right? And I was telling you, first of all, just establishing that theories are not blind guesses. They're not based on conjecture. They're based on a large synthesis of a body of evidence and knowledge, and are compiled together to attempt to explain those things that we cannot directly observe, right? And in the context of critical race theory, that's essentially going to look like critically analyzing the social dynamics of race, particularly in the United States, to such a degree that there are elements of it that can yield predictive power, right? And have scientific significance. And so the basic premise of critical race theory, anyway, was that racism influences everything in society, and that there's nothing that isn't removed from racism. And this is an intellectual framework that started out by examining the significance of laws and policies and the ways that they sustain the racial status quo, but have evolved and expanded to include more comprehensive understandings of racial dynamics in the US. And so I'm going to kind of unpack that a little bit. I'm also going to present to you a sort of theoretical framework that I'm currently working on developing in the department that builds upon these ideas. And I'd love to get your feedback, or for you to even scrutinize these ideas if you're interested in doing so. Right, but before we get there, we still have a few things. I think I already went through this too, did I not? The key characteristics of critical race theory. I guess if I've already gone over these things, I'm not going to do too much detail. I'm going to assume at this point that you have a solid understanding of those things, okay? So moving forward, I don't think I've gotten here. The goal of critical race theory, first of all, is going to be to expose unjust race pattern disparities where they exist, but then to also challenge them too, right? And I'm not talking about exposing any race pattern disparities wherever they exist. There are some race pattern disparities that, for example, are in fact contextually appropriate, contextually relevant. For example, you all are taking a class in the African American Studies department, for which all of the faculty in this department are African American, right? This is not something that critical race theory is trying to disrupt and interject. Same for Asian American studies or Latin American studies or something like that, right? But we are talking about race pattern disparities that are being produced in home ownership, in wealth, in incarceration rates, these kinds of things. In those areas, critical race theory is seeking to expose the production of those race pattern disparities and then to challenge those things. And in so doing, the goal then is to promote racial justice or to advocate for racial change. And so along the lines that we've been talking about a hegemonic culture, did I talk about cultural hegemony yet? Have I discussed that? Maybe I'm blurring the lines because I have so many different sections. Things are kind of jumbled. But I want to show you this video of the kind of, let's say, defensiveness to critical race theory. This is a video I want to watch as a class, and then we'll take a moment to watch it, and then we'll talk about it, and I want to get your perspectives. Okay.
The way of thinking and teaching about America's past and present by looking at the role of systemic racism, what we've just been discussing. But the very term itself, critical race theory, has become a political flashpoint across the country, especially when it comes to how to teach young people about justice and equity in America. As Amna Nawaz reports for our Race Matters series, the debate over its potential role in school curricula has set off a firestorm that has roiled school districts and state legislatures nationwide.
Next year, Jameson Maddox will be a senior here in Loudoun County, Virginia. His favorite subject is history, even though he felt Black history was lacking.
I think there could be some things that happened in history that should have been taught.
In school, did you learn about the Tulsa Massacre?
No.
Did you learn about Juneteenth?
No.
Do you feel like those are things that should be taught as part of your formal
Yes,
education?
definitely.
Jameson's mother, Vanessa, agrees.
This is American history. All of it should be taught in a certain context and also age appropriate.
Maddox, who works as a job recruiter, and her husband raised both their sons in this affluent Northern Virginia suburb over the last 2 decades. Last year, as the national racial reckoning resonated here, Vanessa joined a Facebook group pushing what they see as anti-racism efforts in school.
When I saw the anti-racist parent group, I'm like, okay, I gotta be in that.
What spurred you to join that group in the first place? What has that been like?
There is a definite need for a group like this. I like to be surrounded by like-minded, fair-minded, equitable people. You don't have to think like me, you don't have to be like me, but you do have to be anti-racist.
Not everyone in Loudoun County sees it that way.
There were parents that were just sick of it. They were just sick of, constantly being told, if you don't agree with me, then, you're a racist.
Ian Pryor's 2 daughters are in elementary school here. He's a former Trump administration Justice Department spokesman, now leading a group called Fight for Schools, a political action committee pushing back on equity and inclusion measures.
We're not about not teaching history. We're about teaching history in an objective way that is not represented as America is systemically racist.
When you're looking not at individual acts of racism, but the systemic racism that exists within America's educational institutions, what would you suggest be done right now?
But there's a balancing act here of making sure that there's equal opportunity for all, that we're committed to meritocracy, but also that when we are trying to figure out how to deal with any kind of social problems, we do not overstep and overreact.
Parents who agree with Pryor are now part of a growing chorus opposing what's known as critical race theory, or CRT, often a graduate level framework that examines how the legacy of slavery and segregation in America is embedded in legal systems and policies. The thing is, critical race theory isn't being taught here, but that didn't stop dozens of parents from flooding a recent school board meeting to protest it.
The critical race theory has its roots in cultural Marxism. It should have no place in our schools.
I will do everything I possibly can to fight to the bitter end until you prove to me that you are not teaching my children that they are racist just because they're white.
That outrage echoes messaging ricocheting across right-wing media.
Critical race theory is racist. I don't see race theory, in our Declaration of Independence.
Much of this can be traced back to a September 2020 directive by then-President Trump, instructing agencies to identify and halt funding of anti-bias training for federal employees that suggests, quote, the United States is an inherently racist or evil country. On his first day in office, President Biden used an executive order to revoke the Trump administration's action.
When I hear the talk of critical race theory, I immediately get a signal. It's an alarming system for me because it's a misrepresentation and misuse of the word.
Jalea Lyles-Dunn is the Director of Learning for Justice, which offers resources for teachers to create anti-bias learning experiences.
Culturally relevant, anti-racist instruction models needed. We need a classroom set up, so not just instruction, but we also need a space that lets children know you are welcome here. Inclusive education is a space where we all are at the table together. We all hear everyone's story.
The debate over which stories are included and how they're taught has fueled pushback. Critical race theory is now being leveraged as a catch-all phrase by opponents of equity and inclusion efforts in public education. In May, House Republicans denounced it at a Capitol Hill press conference.
Critical race theory is a divisive ideology.
As did former President Trump at the North Carolina GOP convention this month.
The Biden administration is pushing toxic critical race theory and illegal discrimination into our children's schools.
Nationwide, Republican lawmakers are now legislating on the idea. According to EdWeek, as of June 18, 25 states have introduced bills or taken other steps to restrict education on racism and bias. That includes 5 states, Texas, Idaho, Iowa, Oklahoma, and Tennessee, where bills have already been signed into law. Arizona's proposed bias teaching bill could mean a potential $5,000 penalty for teachers. Texas's bill, effective September 1st, says teachers cannot be compelled to discuss current events, and if they do, they must, quote, strive to explore the topic from diverse and contending perspectives without giving deference. Some educators, meanwhile, are holding Teach the Truth rallies, fighting what they call unwarranted legislation.
I think we're raising of future voters who will not have a well-rounded perspective on their own community and society.
Valerie Wolfson teaches 8th grade social studies in New Hampshire, where a new bill would prohibit so-called divisive concepts related to sex and race from schools.
Teachers would be under pressure for severe censorship or fear of that public judgment. It's set up for people to report on you.
I think you could have a chilling effect on what people teach in their classrooms.
Completely.
Back in Loudoun County, we sat down with school superintendent Scott Ziegler.
We have said for months now, we are not teaching critical race theory in our schools. We're not using any type of program to quote unquote indoctrinate or convert our children. Our equity work is all about doing what is best for children.
That equity work was implemented after outside probes found Black and brown students disproportionately disciplined in Loudoun County, facing racial insults and racially motivated violence, and students of color harmed by school practices.
What was decided at the time was we need to endeavor on a program, a systematic program to help our teachers with this, to give them the knowledge and understanding so they can have conversations around race, very open and very honest and sometimes very tough conversations, so that they can make our schools better for students.
The district put anti-bias training in place for teachers, the majority of whom are white. That was back in 2019. Ian Pryor's group launched this year in 2021.
Superintendent says there is no critical race theory being taught here. Why are you arguing against something that's not being taught?
No one is saying that they're teaching critical race theory in Loudoun County Public Schools like it's physics or chemistry. It's being implemented through teacher trainings, and that ultimately drips down to how they teach our students. And it's not a subject, but it's a way of viewing the world.
Vanessa Maddox says she and other parents will continue to push for equity in schools and a more inclusive education around American history.
The opposition groups are saying, we don't care if you teach Black history or other parts that haven't been taught. We just don't want you to say that all white people are evil. That's not what equity states. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that all history should be taught, regardless of race.
The school year in Loudoun County has just ended, but the debate over what next year will look like is far from over. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Amna Navaz.
Thoughts? Questions, comments, perspectives? For example, perhaps I'm wrong and maybe I need to change up my pedagogical approach, but does anybody feel like I'm indoctrinating them? White people, do you feel like I'm making you feel guilty for being white? I see head shaking no. Okay. Anyone want to share a perspective on that? Yeah, sure.
I just feel like the whole debate that was captured in this clip, it just seemed like so many different people talking and not meeting each other at the same point whatsoever. I have my personal views on who's being more disingenuous, but I think in general, there's just a lack of understanding of what critical race theory even is. And I will say, myself, I didn't really know what it was until this class. I kind of just thought it was just talking about racism in general as critical race theory. So, yeah.
Sure. I totally agree with you. There are people in here, they're not even really meeting each other where they're at. One side of the debate has issues with implementation around what just appears to be diversity and inclusion in general, while the other side is emphasizing teaching history honestly, and everybody seems to be conflicted around critical race theory, but neither side really seems to have a grasp on what it truly is. And so, as I've already explained to you all, right, it is critically analyzing the social dynamics of race with a scientific lens, a scientifically meaningful lens. And it started with an examination of laws and policies that help to sustain white supremacy and therefore race pattern disparities across a wide variety of sectors or perspectives of life quality. But it has evolved into a much more detailed analysis, a critical analysis of the ways that race pattern disparities are produced, and then being able to scientifically understand them to such a degree that you might identify the weak points of racism therein that allow you to disrupt and dismantle it. And so as this idea, or as these ideas evolve through time, the sort of political rhetoric around it is becoming more and more explosive and volatile. And unfortunately, this is the kind of blowback that we observe. Right? Okay, I want to get to, I use the term theory here colloquially because personally, I don't have the level of theory just yet, but I want to introduce to you an expansive concept of racism because I don't think that your book talks about it honestly, okay? Frankly, your book does what most of conventional society does, is it frames racism as a purely negative concept with absolutely no positive benefits or positive potential at all. For example, your core book says, I believe in this particular chapter, but it could be in the first chapter too, it says that racism encompasses both prejudice and discrimination, the practice of treating people differently on the basis of their race. And to an extent, I would say that is a part of racism. But I would argue that the term racism actually needs to be redefined because in doing so, it allows us to have a more expansive, critically aware understanding of racial dynamics that allow us to develop practical, effective solutions to addressing the production of race pattern disparities. I would argue, and I'm currently working on a paper for this. If you're interested in reading this paper, I'm happy to send it to you later. A few students in some of my other sections already requested it and they have it. But basically my definition, I would argue that the term racism needs to be redefined to something along the lines of the ability to distinguish and categorize people based on a generally agreed upon understanding of race. And the reason why I say this is because it positions racism as a neutral capacity. It has the potential to produce oppression, systemic harms, racial trauma, these kinds of things, but it also has the potential to produce all kinds of good too. Let me explain to you through this theoretical framework, okay? If we take this basic concept of racism as I'm articulating it to you, and we place it along a moral spectrum, okay? There are lots of people in society that would paint racism as completely bad, all kinds of negative, any aspect of a pejorative term that you could possibly load onto the term racism is generally what people would describe. And indeed, that's what your book describes, is that racism here, what I would call traditional racism, is generally the production of race pattern disparities. That can be through individual means, institutional means, systemic means, etc., right? But there is also something like benign racism, racism that is at its core fundamentally racist, but does not produce harm, nor does it produce good. I'll give you an example. Racially, how would you describe me? And why would you call me that? Because I'm a black, according to your understanding of race, you would call me a black person, right? Congratulations, you're racist. That's a racist statement. It is. Technically speaking, recognizing race, seeing and distinguishing racial difference makes you racist. The fact that I had everybody in this class racially segregate according to their own racial identities, and you all did so accordingly, proves my point that you are all racist. Now, Gavin, the fact that you can see and acknowledge my racial identity, which I do identify as a black man, does that make you a bad person? No, it doesn't. Does the fact that you all followed my instruction along with the exercise that we did where I racially segregated you, does that make you bad people? Okay, it makes you racist, right? But it doesn't make you bad people. And I feel like your book does a really terrible job of limiting your understanding of race and racism, and I feel as though this theoretical framework might expand the dialogue, because what we're exploring right now is actually a kind of benign racism. The ability to see and distinguish race with no visible effects, positive or negative, on race pattern disparities. More importantly, this concept, or this theoretical framework, opens us up for being able to identify what potential solutions might resolve many of the problems that we have in our current society, the one where the production of race pattern disparities is normalized. And that leads us to anti-racism, which is in essence a kind of racism. In this case, it leads to the reduction of race pattern disparities. So if you recall at the beginning of this lecture, I know it was last week, I showed you graphs, I showed you images of race pattern disparities in home ownership rates, in wealth, in incarceration, in life expectancy at birth, right? You've seen textbook examples of race pattern disparities, and we've talked a lot about how those things are produced. But I also put on you the question of, theoretically, how could we go about bringing those race pattern disparities to a point of statistical convergence in their own contextually appropriate ways? And I emphasize to you that I'm not, let's say we're talking about incarceration rates. I'm not advocating that white people somehow need to be more incarcerated to level the playing field for black people, but rather in its appropriate context, how can we either lower the difference between these disparities or reduce the disparities altogether, right? And so in order to resolve those things, what we're fundamentally talking about is the reduction of race pattern disparities. And you don't get here by accident. The only way you can actually get here, believe it or not, is with racism, okay? So let me give you an example. The African American Alumni Association Scholarship here at LMU. That's a kind of anti-racist discrimination. Why? Because it's providing funds and money to historically marginalized people who otherwise would not have the opportunity to be here, and they apply for those fundings, right? They apply for that funding, but no one else, not necessarily no one else, it's not necessarily being racially restrictive, but it is trying to devote a special kind of effort and help and support to this targeted group of people. That is a form of anti-racist discrimination, but we wouldn't call it bad. Do we call the Native American Alumni Association Scholarship a bad scholarship because it's trying to allocate funds to historically marginalized groups? No. The same can be said for affirmative action, for example, right? The idea being that if we truly believe in cultivating a fair, just, and equal society, then in order for us to be able to even get there, we have to understand, first of all, expand our awareness of what racism even is, to recognize that racism is not just all bad. You can see and recognize racial difference, and that doesn't automatically make you a bad person. So now add history into your ability to see and distinguish. You'll see histories and patterns of marginalization, of oppression, of lesser opportunity. And what do you do to level the playing field if not give those historically marginalized people selective advantages that they would otherwise not have access to? In essence, when we get to a society where all of these race pattern disparities in a perfect world come to statistical convergence, we can keep it there because we can see it, we can monitor it, we can maintain it. That's what that looks like. If we just talk about racism in this very limited way, we've talked about institutional racism, we've talked about individual racism, systemic racism, and we've only been talking about these things in a very negative way. But the moment I put on you, what does systemic anti-racism look like? Can you use your imagination to think about what that would look like? I'm literally asking, that's not a rhetorical question. What do you think that looks like?
Affirmative action as an example.
Yeah, affirmative action would absolutely be an example because it is aware that there are race pattern disparities that we are seeking to remedy and resolve, and so then we are engaging in a kind of anti-racist discrimination in order to do so. Is that anti-white? Not necessarily. Let's say hypothetically in some perfect world, we somehow magically ended up as a society on this end of the spectrum, where everybody has equal opportunity, there's fair pay, there's policies that support lots of social safety nets, these kinds of things. And then somehow, for some magical reason, white people suddenly end up the most overwhelming represented group in terms of homelessness. Well, hey, we can see that, and we need to start developing policies that help these white people so that they're not ending up in the positions of homelessness that they currently are, right? But the only way we can get there is with racism, which means that we need to expand and understand, or expand our awareness for what racism is and acknowledge that it's not all just unethical racism. There are benign forms of racism, there are ethical forms of racism, and if we can kind of understand comprehensively where racism fits, this would then mean that everybody's racist. You're racist, I'm racist, your parents are racist, your children, if you choose to have them, will be racist. And it's not so much about the fact that we can end racism. That is fundamentally impossible. That will never happen so long as our visible differences are clear as day. Instead, it becomes about what we do with our racism. Any thoughts on this? Yeah. And please use the microphone.
Yeah. This is like super, like maybe a little bit tangential, but there's like, I can say personally, I definitely support like the anti-racism, like affirmative action policies. But I've also, like as a history student, there's like a few kind of examples of that we can look back on, and a few different examples, like actually what was done in the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. Which was really interesting. They were kind of like the first people to do like DEI, basically. Yeah. And it had some really great effects, like the preservation of like local languages, but it also resulted in like a lot of balkanization.
A lot of what?
Balkanization. Like it kind of ended up dividing people as well.
Okay.
And I feel like we're seeing that in this country. And I just don't know how like you can do anti-racism without like causing some level of like pushback and divisiveness, I guess.
Yeah, sure. And I would say to that, I'm sure you've heard of the saying, equality is going to feel like oppression to those who are privileged. It's kind of the same thing, right? For every yin, there's always a yang. And even though we can move towards a more equitable society, an inclusive society for all, there are lots of people who are going to have problems with that because to an extent, they're going to feel like they're missing out. And they're really not, but it's going to feel that way, especially if you are already coming from a place of privilege where you benefit from the status quo being somewhere over here on this end of the spectrum. Does that make sense? Yeah.
No, I was going to say, like, I think it's interesting because racism, I think just like the term itself, like, or at least like how like I've just always thought of it, is just like generally as like a bad connotation. And like even like when I like say the word racism, I'm like, it just kind of, my mind just is like think that's a bad thing. But I never really thought of it as like, just like from like a bird's eye view, just like face value. It's really just the separation of like it's just the simple separation. And I think like that kind of discourse is why people like don't understand critical.
Yeah, because the moment I say we're critically analyzing race and we're going to talk about racism, immediately in people's minds, they synonymize it with the word bad. So if I'm talking to a body of students about racism who happen to be white, all of a sudden it's, oh my God, is he going to make me feel guilty? And I don't know if I want to say the wrong thing. I'm not a bad person. I'm not a racist. And there starts to be like this dance where you want to tiptoe around the sensitivities of avoiding associating yourself with this negative end of the spectrum, not completely understanding that to an extent, like this is where the scientific literature currently positions racism. This is where most layperson culture positions racism. But in truly understanding what racism even is, you could like go to a comedy show, like go to the Laugh Factory, buy a ticket for $20, go to the Laugh Factory, and like half the jokes will be racist. but everybody's laughing. Well, is it unethical? Well, not quite. I'm not necessarily arguing that comedic racism is somehow ethical, but that there is a moral gray area there. It's more than just it being bad. And when you expand your awareness of racism in this way, it kind of breaks down that defensive wall just a little bit to go, you know what? Yeah, I can acknowledge that, like, okay, that's what makes me racist, and I can see how perhaps I've done some racially unethical things in the past, but I can also do some racially ethical things in the future, right? I want to give you an example of that. Okay, let's say, for example, like I just all throughout this, I've already established your book overwhelmingly biases the interpretation of racism. It's not really your book. It's just more like this is the conventional understanding, right? But we've reviewed microaggressions, for example, where we talked about those subtle slights that make people feel like they're in a racially hostile environment. But now that I've expanded your awareness of this concept of racism existing on a moral spectrum, and you could think about, if you can picture in your mind, racism is somewhere, the microaggression is somewhere in the middle here, right? It's not all the way unethical, it's just kind of morally ambiguous. You have something called, what would be the opposite of microaggression? What would be its opposite? Macro compliment. No. You're close, but it's still on the micro level. But what's the antonym of aggression? Progression. No.
Passive.
No. Compassion. Oh, support. Yeah, kind of like that. Support. Micro-compassion. Right? The theoretical opposite of microaggression is going to be micro-compassion. I'll give you an example. When I was a grad student at the University of Washington, I was teaching a biological anthropology class. And the textbook we were teaching from, it was incredibly expensive. It was like $300 just for one of these textbooks, okay? And I had one student in my class. She was Muslim, she was black, she was the only one in this class that was there. And she came to me and she said, hey, Mr. Doyle, because I didn't have my doctorate at the time. And she told me, I can't afford the book. I don't have access to it. I don't really know what to do, but I need to pass this class. Now, a part of me was like, oh, I'm about to go out to lunch. I don't really have time for this, or blah, blah, blah. But it occurred to me that she's the only Muslim in your class. She's underrepresented on this campus, and she's the only kind that looks like herself in your classroom. What can you do to help this student? Go out of your way to help her. I ended up taking her down to the copy room where we spent about 2 hours scanning every single page of each chapter that we needed to cover for the book, just so she could have it. And that doesn't necessarily mean that, like, if a white student came to me and said the same thing, that I'm gonna go, oh, I'm not gonna do it because you're white. But it's just more like, in that moment, seeing and understanding that this person is probably coming from a historically marginalized background. They probably genuinely cannot afford the book, but that's not gonna stop them from succeeding if I can give them access to it. Maybe it is on me to take a little bit of time and let me help them out. They're black, they're Muslim, they kind of need that little bump. Let me give it to them. It's a kind of micro-compassion, and then ultimately the student ends up passing the class almost with a perfect score, just off of scans that I gave her to the textbook because she couldn't afford the book, right? That is an example of, like, micro-compassion, seeing and recognizing that there is somebody who can benefit from a selective advantage that you can give them, and it is kind of on the basis of their race, by virtue of their historic marginalization or their social experience, right? And every single one of you has the capacity to do that. Every single one of you in this class has seen somebody with some kind of visible difference, and knowing and being familiar with the history, in whatever ways you can, you might have the opportunity to extend a little bit of extra compassion that you otherwise wouldn't need to. That is an example of micro-compassion in this regard. Positive racial selection that produces an ethical outcome. Does that make sense? Okay, so that makes me a racist. Do you get it? Am I a bad person for doing what I did? Absolutely not. So now you can understand that it's not necessarily that racism, or at least here's what I am arguing, and I'm currently working on the paper for this. And you're welcome to read the paper. I'm happy to send it to you all. But it's the idea that it's kind of big implications, but racism really does need to be redefined. And it needs to be redefined because our ability to see and distinguish different kinds of people still operates on the ideology of race, but doesn't necessarily have to do with bigotry and prejudice and discriminating or disadvantaging people. Not all the time. Right? But now here's an important question. This is just kind of wrapping up this concept here, right? So I want to push you to think about, because as we get towards the end of this class, you might have to write about this. I want you to start kind of using your creative minds, your imagination, to think about what institutional anti-racism might look like. And again, that is working towards the reduction of race pattern disparities, right? If we see that there are performance gaps in academic achievement based on race, what would institutional anti-racism efforts look like in effort to reduce those, right? If it's about health outcomes, morbidity patterns, wealth inequality, home ownership inequality, and we have a desire to cultivate a truly fair, just, and equal society, start thinking about what institutional, systemic, structural anti-racism looks like, because your book isn't talking about it. Right? And frankly, there's not a whole lot of people that are talking about this at all. They're kind of at the level of anti-racism is just counter to, traditional racism. And I characterize that as traditional racism because often this form of racism, the one that is currently the status quo of our society, is the one that is often pursued and protected by those with politically conservative interests, keeping things the way they are and evoking traditionalism along the way, right? So start thinking about that. But I have a caveat question here. And that caveat question is, with this new theoretical framework that I'm introducing to you of racism being on a moral spectrum, what contextualizes ethical racism from unethical? Because I'll give you an example. If I'm your so-called alt-right, KKK, white supremacist neo-Nazi, and I just learned that there's ethical racism out there, well, great. I'm trying to protect the purity of the white race, and my discrimination against these other marginalized groups is a form of ethical racism. What distinguishes the ethical from the unethical in this regard? What do you think?
I think it could be if it's putting another group in any kind of disposition, or even it's a little bit more far-fetched, but arguing any other group that's not the one you're currently in, because then it's not really if you're trying to promote your own race, then that's obviously falls under the category of racism, but it's not ethical in that.
So you would say producing racial harm is what you're trying to say?
Is unethical?
Yeah, producing racial harm is unethical, right? Yeah. Sure, that's part of it. There's another part of it too. Can anyone think? It's one word, starts with the letter H. Blank, marginalized populations. H, history, right? History is going to distinguish for you where the ethical racism efforts are versus the unethical racism, right? Because again, if we're talking about giving selective advantage to historically marginalized groups on the basis of that history, it means that with an eye towards reducing race pattern disparities, there's a history that produced those things. And because there's a history that produced that inequality, by us selecting which groups will benefit or get the benefits that we want to give them, That's what's going to distinguish the ethical nature of our selection versus the unethical one. And this is why affirmative action is actually a kind of ethical form of anti-racism. Because it sees the historic disadvantage, it sees the historical context, and when at some point we bring all of these patterns to a point of statistical convergence, there's no more need for selective benefits and selective advantage because we've healed society. And we can keep society there until, like I said, one magical day, one group of people starts to teeter-totter away from the rest of collective society. But because we have a data-driven practice, we can kind of see and monitor that and then develop adaptive, responsive policies and initiatives to bring them right the hell back up. But we need racism in order to do that. Otherwise, what's the point? What are we supposed to do? Live in a colorblind society where race pattern disparities continue to be produced and we just pretend as if it's not significant? When it in fact is? No. Right? Something to think about. And this is where cultural hegemony comes in play, okay? Where cultural hegemony, we'll kind of pivot away for just a second, but I want to explain to you that part of the nature of what I'm talking about, the resistance to critical race theory, the resistance to people truly understanding what it is, trying to muddle the waters, these are signs that we are living in a hegemonic culture. In general, the term cultural hegemony is just the values and ideas of the dominant group dictating those of those lesser groups. Okay? So for example, Antonio Gramsci is one of the founding scholars of sociology, for example. And he describes a hegemonic culture as the idea that the dominant ideology of society, the beliefs, explanations, perceptions, values, and morals reflect that of the ruling class. The dominant ideology justifies the social, political, and economic status quo as natural, as inevitable, as perpetual, and beneficial for everyone, rather than as an artificial social construct that benefits only the ruling class. So when I show you an image of race pattern disparities in incarceration, I had, for example, there was a student in another section who goes, well, yeah, but if black people are committing all of the crimes, then what's the problem here? Don't you need to commit crimes in order to get to this outcome? I don't see the issue here, right? Yeah, Antonio, can I get the mic to, or I'm not Antonio, excuse me.
I was just gonna say, like, how do we define crimes?
How do we
like define crimes, right? Because like the dominant ideology defines that for us, so it's kind of like a bait where you get like trapped.
Right, where the dominant ideology dictates what is and is not a crime, and although legally speaking, you know, teaching CRT like I'm doing to you is not a crime, there are people who would certainly attempt to silence me or persecute me if they could do so. Right? Okay. But in general, these are ideas that are often used, actions even, that are used to justify a kind of political domination or just the social hierarchy in general. Let me explain it in these terms, right? I feel like this illustration perfectly articulates what it is like to live in a hegemonic culture. Where, for example, we could characterize it as a kind of tribalism. We have here on the left side our blessed homeland with our glorious leader, our great religion, our noble populace, and our heroic adventures. But on that side, they're brutish invaders, they're backward savages, they're primitive superstition, they're wicked despot. It's a way to rationalize how people can see themselves being better than others or seeing that other people are lesser than they, right? And in general, members of the dominant group will be in fact inclined to believe that their claim to this inherent benevolence is in fact justified. And in doing so, it can render lots of injustice, lots of oppression, lots of inequality invisible. Okay. Does anyone know what's going on in this image? What happened? Image on the left. Can I get the...
It's from a few years ago when Kaepernick kneeled for the national anthem.
And why was he kneeling?
It was a protest statement against to be honest, I'm not sure.
It was against police brutality. And he was kneeling like Martin Luther King did during the civil rights marches. Kneeling not necessarily to destroy his NFL career, but because he wanted to use his own celebrity platform to draw attention to injustice. Do you know what the consequences of this was? The consequences was that he was essentially blackballed from the NFL just for kneeling silently. He wasn't loud, he wasn't sounding any alarms off, he wasn't crying wolf or anything. But lots of NFL fans were pissed off that he would kneel during the national anthem by drawing attention to a form of injustice, of police brutality against black people. Now, what's interesting is that when you are in a hegemonic culture, you're not allowed to critically examine certain ideas, events, or people. And the reason for that is because it points out the fallacies in their so-called benevolence. And in fact, this hegemonic cultural response will be one that encourages people to hold on to their cultural beliefs and ideas no matter what. In a hegemonic culture, you're not allowed to critique certain ideas, events, or people. That's the example for Kaepernick here. Drawing criticism to police brutality, the brutalization of black bodies unjustly and without due cause. It yields a kind of a rebuke response, a censorship response, the response that seeks to punish those who even draw attention to the injustice that truly is there. And the reason why you get the censorship, the rebuke, the punishment is because these things serve to reinforce the dominance of the dominant group. I'll give you an example. Check this out.
Bills focusing on critical race theory and political indoctrination are a step closer to becoming law, having easily passed through the South Dakota House. Get a closer look at what the bills do as KCAU 9 reporter Dylan Adams breaks down the impact on educators in our top story tonight at 10.
Hey Tim, House Bills 1012 and 1337 were both significantly amended Tuesday to erase any mention of critical race theory and instead replace the term with a broader subject of, quote, divisive concepts. The English author Aldous Huxley once wrote, "Facts do not cease to exist because they are ignored." That's what South Dakota educators are concerned will happen as a result of House Bills 1012 and 1337. Educators like USD professor Dr. Timothy Shorn, who says he can't comprehend how his colleagues are to teach about uncomfortable parts of history without delving into what some may consider divisive material.
The notion that we can't discuss the fact that past events and the institutions that came out of those events could still be racist is rather unreasonable and illogical.
A South Dakota high school social studies teacher who chose to remain anonymous says, quote, "We need to know about our past, both the good and the bad. We need to feel uncomfortable with some of the horrors and pride in some of the honor." Sydney Davis represents the southeastern corner of the state and says while she had concerns over the original intent of the bill, the amended version won't impact the curriculum taught in K-12 schools.
That is really what ultimately protects students from is the compelled speech. It explicitly states in the bill that this does not interfere with academic freedom in the classroom, the discussion of ideas. That is all still very much permitted.
And Davis says both bills will now move over to the Senate, where they're expected to be heard by committee next week. For now, Dylan Adams, KCAU 9 News.
Okay, thoughts? Feelings about this? This is what it looks like in the modern era to live in a hegemonic culture. The one where you can critically examine, let's say, just the social dynamics of race and develop predictive abilities on that front that allow you to kind of revolutionize society towards visible racial equality, and then to implement those ideas on the basis of that theoretical perspective draws censorship, rebuke, punishment. Yeah. Thank you.
I feel like banning certain topics is kind of an infringement on people's like freedom of speech.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're teaching CRT in like the correct way, then it's just showing actual history and things that genuinely did happen and caused long-lasting effects systemically to this day.
Yep.
So it doesn't even impose ideas on people. It's just facts.
Literally. But I'll go so far as to say no one is teaching critical race theory or any real theories for that matter in grade school, right? These are high-level concepts that require kind of pre-existing knowledge. You're only really going to start to learn these things at the undergraduate level or at the graduate level. There's no room for learning about these things in grade school. But even if that was the case, it's still important for young children to just learn history, the good and the bad. Yeah.
I just kind of to add on that, I mean, we teach how during like the World Wars, there was like the Holocaust, obviously, but teaching that didn't make people think that all Germans are bad to this day or that all, like it doesn't, I don't think it actually influences how people view races or makes them more racist. It just kind of makes you aware of the culture that we're in. Correct. But now understand that most of society, I would say most of white America, would fundamentally disagree with you because they synonymize racism with bad. So any discussion about racism in the context of American history must somehow now mean that all white people are bad and evil, and I've got to make you feel guilty and responsible for that, when that's not what I'm doing. And so now laws are beginning to get passed to try to stop people, including university professors, from even just being able to tell you, hey, we can critically examine the social dynamics of race. And oh wait, hey, it turns out that like being racist is not entirely a bad thing. It doesn't mean it's a good thing either. It's just more like it depends on how you use your racism. And like we could totally use our racism to make a fair and just and equal society for everybody, but we have to be racially selective in order to do it. And here's how. And then you've got a bunch of people going, oh, no, this is bad. You can't talk about this. You've got to share both sides. It's a divisive concept. Does anyone in this classroom feel like I'm dividing them? Am I pitting people against one another? The whites versus the blacks? No, like that's not what's happening here, right? So it becomes painfully clear where people's political priorities are. I'll get to you in just a second. I saw your hand. It becomes painfully clear where people's priorities truly are and who they really are, when now you can clearly understand what it is that I'm talking about, what I'm teaching, and you can see that the people who are trying to like make a monster out of this, what are they actually trying to do? And they're trying to keep things the way they are, which often means continuing the production of race pattern disparities and just shut the fuck up and don't talk about it. Does that make sense?
Personally, I think it's more important for like schools to teach the bad more than the good, because that just like allows for students to actually be aware and not repeat history and repeat mistakes. Yeah. So like only teaching the good side and like ignoring all types of like history with racism and stuff actually like keeps students blind, and it's more likely for history to repeat itself.
I absolutely agree with you. I would say on the back end, absolutely students need to learn about the horrific sides of history, but then what needs to be implemented are those beneficial ideas of how you can be more inclusive to students of different backgrounds, lifestyles, and experiences, and how you can make them feel like their contributions or their significance in the classroom matters. Right? It's all sides of the spectrum that are comprehensively implemented, but I fundamentally agree with you. I think everybody needs to learn about the atrocities of history. It's unfortunate that for some reason there's this political effort that if we talk about these things, it must mean that we're trying to make white people feel guilty, which is absolutely beyond the case. That is not what's going on at all. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so in general, what I'll say here, because there's a bunch of words on the screen, I don't want you to just copy them down verbatim, but what I will say is that in a hegemonic culture, right, there are aspects of the dominant view, the dominant perspective, the one that produces the oppression, the one that produces those race pattern disparities. It becomes normalized. The abuse, the oppression, the marginalization, it becomes normalized, and subsequent generations become socialized to accept those conditions as if they're normal. Okay? Think about this. At one point in time, we've already established in this class that there were black indentured servants and white indentured servants that cohabitated together. They lived together relatively equally, and they did work together. And then at some point, here comes the slave codes. And they set a legal precedent. But for the time being, it was just words on a paper. People had to get used to enforcing those laws. People had to get used to having those laws be kind of normal. Okay? And then at some point, subsequent generations just saw these laws for that's just how it is. It's just the way things are. They don't see it as a legal anomaly. They don't see it as words on a paper. It becomes their culture. So now you have subsequent generations for almost 250 years of people who just live and work, and every day that they're in this society, it's just normal to have slaves. It's normal to see black people as inferior. It is the norm to understand that white people are the apex of civilization. And that's how it is. And then that becomes a part of the culture. What I'm describing to you is the process of normalization. Okay? And it's through that normalization that then the corruption in the culture, the production of these unjust patterns, the ways that people are oppressed and marginalized becomes invisible. And then you end up at some arbitrary point in the future, you end up with people who might not even be aware that they exist in an oppressive society at all. There's lots of people, not necessarily saying yourselves, but there's lots of people in American society today who never even have to think about their race. They don't have to think about their racialized experience. They don't even think they have one. And so it's very uncomfortable then to hear other people talking about race and drawing significance to it. Right? There's lots of people who feel like if you're talking about race, if you can emphasize race, then you must be the racist, the bad person, right? Yes, that makes them racist, but no, that doesn't make them bad people necessarily. It's what they're doing with their racism, right? You might also end up with a society that holds flawed or problematic beliefs. I showed you a video last week of children, black children, who somehow internalized anti-black beliefs and perspectives. And we were talking about where are they getting these things from? Where do they get the idea that like being black makes them inherently bad when they themselves are black? It's because they live in a hegemonic culture that centers anti-black values. And now they hold these flawed, problematic beliefs and don't even realize that they do until somebody else points it out. Creates a kind of cognitive dissonance that for many people is very uncomfortable, and they want to shut down critical race perspectives, right? And then finally, there's lots of people who would even condone or support the systemic oppression of others. They know it exists. They don't have a problem with it at all. To see race pattern disparities in home ownership, in wealth, in incarceration rate, in life expectancy at birth and go, that's just how it is. That's the natural order of things. Well, no, it isn't. Excuse me. Okay, so this is what it means to live in a hegemonic culture. And this is where we get to discussions of white privilege, because at the center of the hegemonic culture is that dominant perspective, is that dominant group's experience, from which the privilege that we're talking about here, it's unearned advantages, but it's more like having the ability to experience life without your race being a barrier to success, without your race being the reason why you're not getting access to specific kinds of opportunities or advantages, right? Talking about white privilege does tend to make some people uncomfortable, because there's lots of people who go, what white privilege? I don't have white privilege. I don't see it at all. No one ever gave me anything because I'm white. Well, it's more like, because the person is white, it means that they have one less aspect of their identity that is used against them in their journey to success. Right? And so when that is rendered invisible, what we can see there is evidence of a hegemonic culture, or living in a hegemonic culture. There are key characteristics to white privilege. The first, obviously, as I just said, is it's invisible to those who have it, and that's a fundamental part of living in a hegemonic culture, right? Lots of people are completely unaware of how their racial identity, whether acknowledged or not, affords them specific kinds of benefits or specific advantages. But then more importantly, centered in this hegemonic experience is the normalization of whiteness. To see whiteness as the position from which it is the default. It is the absence of a racialized experience. It is the absence of culture. It is the absence of cultural identity. And the further away one moves from whiteness, the more deviant they become, the more other they become. Right? And I'm being redundant down here with unearned advantages. You don't need to write that down, right? Okay? So there's lots of examples. Social, economic benefits, obviously. I showed you patterns of home ownership and wealth, for example, the racial wealth gap. But then also representation. If you recall, when we were talking about where these young black children were getting these racialized perspectives from, there were a lot of you that were pointing to the media, right? Images that you see on Disney, on Fox, and cartoons, and I don't think Cocomelon was said in this class, but you get the point, right? There were lots of people that were talking about media representation and portrayal. And that's a fundamental aspect of it. It's a kind of privilege to be able to see repeated images of yourself on TV or members of your racial group, and often those members are elevated or highlighted and emphasized. They're the most important people on the screen relative to the plot or the story or the film, right? Okay. It can be the freedom from racial profiling, the freedom from not having negative stereotypes influence how people see you. But it can also be systemic advantage. And by systemic advantage here, I am talking in the sort of scientific sense, that sort of most macro level view that is fluid from the structural or institutional level, all the way down to the individual level, that produces favorable outcomes and is in fact pervasive in life expectancy, in incarceration, in wealth, in home ownership. Okay. The reason why talking about white privilege in relation to cultural hegemony matters, and even in relation to critical race theory, the reason why it matters is because if we don't talk about these things, it can maintain or serve to maintain racial inequality. How can we possibly talk about what it means to cultivate a fair and equal or equitable society if we can't talk about all sides of the table, right? Okay. If we don't talk about everyone who has a seat at the table and has a plate and how much food they have on their plate to entertain this figure of speech, if we don't do that, it makes cultivation of equality a whole lot harder, and it makes addressing the racism a whole lot harder. And there's lots of perspectives that would say, yes, you should teach African American studies. Yes, you should teach Latin American studies. But then they have a problem when it comes to teaching whiteness or spotlighting whiteness in a way that is objective relative to critical assessments of race. Because it is uncomfortable to sit with the spotlight on you in a way that appears to suggest that there is some kind of unearned benefit or advantage. Okay? So the impact here is that if we don't talk about these things, that still can contribute to the continuation of these disparities, right? A lot of these race pattern disparities. But this is not about guilt, because even in the lessons of white privilege or white benefit or advantage is an opportunity for allyship. No, none of you in this room, whether you identify as white or not, none of you in this room asked specifically for those benefits to be given to you. And no, you shouldn't feel guilty because society tends to benefit and advantage people who look like you. But what if you could use those benefits and advantages in your favor to cultivate a more fair and just society for everyone around you? That's called allyship. And the only aspect of significance that allyship holds is if we can in fact have a discussion about white privilege and what it means that you can do with your white privilege. The white privilege that you didn't ask for, that society apparently is giving to you, and that you yourself truly believe in the cultivation of a fair and inclusive and just society. That means you can take those advantages that you didn't ask for and start using your position in whatever ways possible to truly cultivate a more fair and racially just society. It gives significance to allyship. So it's not about guilt. Talking about white privilege is not about making you feel guilty. Absolutely not. More importantly, the other thing is that just because white privilege can exist doesn't automatically make you prejudiced either. Racially prejudiced, right? That by some stretch of the imagination, to acknowledge your privilege somehow means that you're like complicit in this complex system of racism that nobody asked for. That's absolutely not the case. Okay? Racial prejudice is racial prejudice on its own, whether a person is benefiting from a position of privilege or not. So at no point when we talk about whiteness on Thursday, because we're going to go through a detailed review of whiteness and the perspectives of whiteness scholars, at no point should you feel uncomfortable, should you feel threatened by this idea that we can shed light on the topic of whiteness just as we're doing for blackness or for Latin Americans or Middle Easterners or Asian Americans or any such backgrounds or identity, okay? So now I just want to move forward to the extended reading. It was understood that, right, at the start of class, you submitted your summaries for the Lads and